musicologist and musician named Honor, to which we are honored to have him here tonight. So if you stay, you'll actually hear a live performance at the end of this evening. Why is music and why is sound ecology important? This goes to the heart of the question of the bioeconomy. We see an intersection between creativity, art, technology, science, and the need to produce green jobs all over the planet. I think it's important that we locate this conversation around the bioeconomy through the lens of creativity and science, and that goes to the heart of the spirit of Cooper Union. And with that, I think I will start my presentation. Slides, please. As I mentioned, the CPL will be incubating initiatives. Some of these initiatives will be generated internally to Cooper Union. Some of them will be generated in partnership with civic society. One particular initiative we're exploring at the moment is this question of what does it mean to work within planetary constraints? What does it mean to imagine a future where we can live within the means of one world? Next slide, please. The bioeconomy is so much more than biosynthetic fuels. It really speaks to the whole gamut of opportunities of a post-fossil fuel era. Next slide, please. At current consumption rates, humanity will need the resources of 2.3 planets by 2050. It is clear that that will not be achievable. And for those of you who may believe that 2050 is far away, if you remember the transition of South Africa to, through the leadership of Nelson Mandela, 1994 is actually further away to us now than 2050 is. This is a time frame that is within our horizon and certainly within the horizon of our children and our grandchildren. So we need to have to take serious action in this particular moment. Next slide. The polycrisis is quite particular. This polycrisis is a condition in which there are a range of intervening and co-supporting challenges to which no singular solution can be solved. And one way to crystallize this polycrisis is through this framing of what does it mean to live within the means of one planet. In 2050, there will be approximately 9.7 billion people, of which 70% shall be in cities, and many of those cities shall be in the global south. For all of humanity to live within the boundaries of our planet, the impact of each human being in 2050 will have to be approximately 57% less than that of the average person living today. Now, some might argue that technology will allow us to be more efficient. Some might argue that we might need to think carefully about strategies such as degrowth. There are other scholars who have said that we might need to change our lifestyles. There is, through the bioeconomy, the potential to not only maintain aspiration, which is important for the global south and the generations to come, but a possibility of living reasonably within the means of the planet in a regenerative manner. Next slide. So in terms of understanding the polycrisis, it means that we need to interact with this challenge from a number of different pressure points. It'll require engineering, it'll require architecture, it'll require legislation, it'll require business, it'll require the whole width of civil society to approach this. Gone are the days in which one particular technical solution will be able to address the situation that we're in right now. The polycrisis requires polyvalent solutions. Next slide. In the absence of these polyvalent solutions, we find systemic collapse, environmental decay, unintended migration, or rather through climate change, and of course extreme weather patterns, which impacts on climate financing, development, and a whole range of human developmental indicators which are currently at stake. And what's fascinating about this onset of the polycrisis is that it's a non-linear condition. The idea that we can slowly progress towards 2050 and gradually understand the impacts of climate are not true. Many environments will experience what we call tipping moments or tipping events, which means that the shift between what we know and what is to come will be somewhat catastrophic. So it is imperative that we understand how do we mediate and interact with this polycritical condition as soon as possible. Next slide. To put things into picture about what this growth looks like, and I won't read all of the slides for you there, but to accommodate the largest wave of urban growth in human history, we expect to add 2.2 trillion feet of new floor area in terms of global building stock, the equivalent of adding an entire New York City to the world every month for the next 40 years. We have to ask ourselves, what would that urbanization look like? What will the energy profile of those cities be? What will the aspirations be of those communities, and what are the current models which exist, which cannot survive and provide all of the needs of those future generations. Achieving not only net zero targets, but actually thinking about a regenerative approach towards sustainable agriculture and various natural resources will require us a complete rethink of what does urbanization look like for the next century. Next slide. But where did this start? Some of you may know that I'm an advocate of this notion of the sixth industrial revolution. Some of you might be more familiar with the fourth industrial revolution, and I'll unpack the distinctions. But what this diagram begins to highlight is the rapid change. If you think of where we are right now, roughly 2024, midway between 2000 and 2050, there are four, let's call it major epochs, 750 to 1850, 1850 to 1950, 1950 to 2050. It's actually three. What we see is that post-1950 is a radical acceleration of temperature, acceleration of population, CO2 concentration, GDP rise, but at the same time inequality, so that's an important factor, loss of tropical rainforest, increased water use, species extinction. This great acceleration has been unprecedented on this planet. Next slide. And what does it mean when we talk about this unprecedented acceleration? I would argue that in that short period of time of the 20th century, almost going back to 1928, with Le Corbusier's vision for urbanization, to the explosion of the hydrogen bomb in Castle Bravo, which for the first time deposited particles all the way around the world within 23 days. And of course, the Federal Highway Act of 1956 and 1954, which completely reimagined transportation and urbanization. These three particular moments mark the beginnings of the Anthropocene, or the time of the Anthrome, the time in which humans' impact on ecological environments are much more powerful than that of nature. Prior to this time, humanity's impact on nature was not that significant. Next slide. So what is the bioeconomy? The bioeconomy contributes to a nature-positive green economy. It seeks to target effective and sustainable production of bio-based products and solutions for society. It improves sustainable consumption and production. It's circular in fashion and manner, and it's the application of science and technology and innovation that is regenerative in nature. Next slide. It is a vast terrain for opportunity in terms of higher education, partnership between countries, economic strategy and partnerships, food and agriculture, bioenergy, aquatic and water systems, bioproducts and biomaterials, forestry. All of these things have the ability to transform and ensure that by the time we reach 2050, we're in a position where we're not only able to service the needs of that vast population that is about to enter into the world, but in a way that is regenerative and productive for the planet at large. This, in many ways, has been described by some as the just energy transition, which is a coupling of the social dynamics of how we need to think about affordable and equitable energy access to millions, but at the same time ensuring that the planet is not suffering in that process. Next slide. The opportunity of the bioeconomies are also vast. I have the pleasure of engaging with a number of scholars in this space and finding a range of materials which can effectively replace a whole host of materials which we couldn't even imagine. A lot of these are biodegradable, a lot of them, others are bio-based, and of course we are seeing a strong drive for recycling, whether it's in glass, steel, aluminum, and other components of the economy. But I tend to focus on the bioeconomy because I think it's a less focused area of attention and requires our greatest intelligence to be focused. I won't on the slide except that it begins to describe the basket, if you will, how we can move towards a situation where we move between socio-cognitive boundaries, our understanding of what we know, technological boundaries, social boundaries, and planetary boundaries. What the bioeconomy suggests is that planetary boundaries should be fundamental to our understanding of how we operate economically, as opposed to being tertiary or ancillary to economic strategy. Next slide. I did explain before that I would expand on what I meant by the sixth industrial revolution. And I'm proud to say that the Cooper Union has been in all stages of the industrial revolution, going right back to our founder, Peter Cooper, and his invention with steam, to the second industrial revolution around electricity, Thomas Edison, to the third industrial revolution in computing, where we've had amazing electrical engineers from this place really take forward that sector, to where we are right now in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, which is about the interconnectedness or the connectedness of things, IoT. But as I'm sure you are all aware, that about a understanding of a lot of the discussion is around what I would argue the Industrial Revolution is coming, overlaps very strongly with the Fourth Industrial Revolution. However, to center enough, I believe that economics, which is inclusive of human viability, but also ensures that the planet is part of every single conversation. The question to this particular community, when I say that, I mean the Cooper Union, is who will be the inventors and the agents that will be the arbiters of the future that will allow us to moving towards a planet-centered bioeconomic reality. Next slide. And I also wanted to show that we have a history in this space. Peter Cooper, our founder, invented gelatin in 1822, which was later to become Jell-O. That is indeed a bioeconomic product. Next slide. We've had debates in this very hall going back to the 1860s and 1870s. Professor Edwards spoke about the future of coral and coral islands in 1863. And also Professor Edward Moore spoke about the challenge of ancient glaciers on this continent and how to preserve them as far back as 1874. So the bioeconomy is not a new thing. It has just been fringed to how the fossil economy debates have dominated the trajectory of economic development. And now we're finding that the challenges of resource depletion as well as economic challenge of equity and access are now coming to fruition, that we have to revisit ideas which are in fact have been in place in many parts of the world. I had a wonderful chat with one of my panelists who also spoke about the potential to recapture traditional economic practices which could be very useful for a bioeconomic future. And we'll discuss that later on today. Next slide. I want to quickly go over these slides because we have a number of panelists who will speak quite eloquently about the potential of Africa, given the context of today's discussion in this discourse. But I wanted to maybe highlight a couple of things. Next slide, please. I've mentioned the challenge and opportunity of economic growth and demographic change. Some of you have heard the statistics that by the year 2050, 1 in 4 people will be African. Many of cities of the global south will be doubling in size between 2050 and 2060. That real estate potential that I mentioned is essentially one that is not only an African challenge, it is indeed a global one, but Africa is a unique crucible for conversations about what this new urbanization could look like. Next slide. It's also important to couple this question of growth in biomaterials to the rate in which carbon is being generated through traditional construction techniques. Various reports have been produced in this regard, and I'm also very glad that one of our panelists has been instrumental in doing an update with the United Nations in terms of biomaterials and its potential to be transformative in terms of the global economy. Next slide. Lots of discussions have been had about net zero, and I'm indeed an advocate of it. I've worked with many organizations who have signed up to it, and I believe that philanthropic organizations, companies, and other organizations should adhere to these standards as best as they possibly can. But I'm also an advocate of the fact that targeting net zero is not enough. We have to move beyond net zero because in some instances, the fascination of carbon capture does not address the challenges of biodiversity, does not address the challenges of the capital redistribution that might be required to support communities in those particular areas, and also masks the complexity of the polycritical condition that I described before. So moving with net zero is critical, but also moving beyond net zero is an important part of the conversation. So we align ourselves to many of the protocols and statements that have been made out there, but Flow seeks to work to this idea about how we can live within one world. And that requires a beyond net zero approach. Next slide. This is an amazing diagram produced by a colleague of mine, which highlights that transition in a sort of visual manner, which basically describes how cities have historically extracted from the ground, and now we need to move towards a position in which cities actually contribute towards a regenerative model. So by shifting away from traditional materials, we can actually not only change our profile of how our cities look, but our relationship to the planet itself. Next slide. In closing, and I have just 2 more slides, one of the challenges that I put forward to me and my colleagues who've been working on some of these ideas for some time is, so what does it mean to live within one world? What are those conditions? What are the sort of metrics out there? So we developed the beginnings of what we call the 4C framework, looking at impact on community, impact on climate, impact on distribution of capital, impact on circularity. I believe that a project that is profoundly engaged with the question of living within one world cannot only be about capital returns, it cannot only be about carbon in terms of climate, it cannot only be circular, we also have to engage community. And this becomes a sort of mandala or a rubric for how I begin to hope that we could start to assess projects and quantify their impact in terms of reaching that 57% reduction per capita by 2050 as described earlier. Next slide. So in closing, we require an enabling environment for this. Governance is key. We also have to generate demand for bioproducts through legislation. Science, research, and innovation is key. Partnerships and collaboration are important. Climate change does not obey political or geographical boundaries. It is a planetary phenomena, and humans will be affected by it irrespective of what passport they carry. So partnerships that are transnational in nature need to be very thoughtful. They need to be thematically oriented as opposed to geographically bound by citizenship. Infrastructure will be critical, and we need to reimagine the infrastructure of the future. We cannot replicate the infrastructure of the cities of the past and expect it to serve the cities of the future. We also require an approach which is not just top-down, but also bottom-up. It needs to work from both directions. It's clear that there's a role for municipalities, for governments, for state declarations, etc. But how can we make these bioeconomic opportunities relevant to people on the ground? And also the development and recognition of intellectual property, which needs to be both preserved, enhanced, and encouraged. Finance needs to come to the table. I remember reading an article where John Kerry was quoted about the former envoy for climate with the president, was quoted about the need to generate finance because the technology is there, but the capital is not moving. I think that's an important part of what we need to discuss tonight. And of course, moving beyond net zero, as I've mentioned. Next slide. This is an image of an innovation which I shared with my students, but I thought it might be useful for today's discussion. There's a very talented professor who's managed to make the equivalent of transparent glass by basically bleaching the lignin that you find in wood, which can also be found in leaves, and it can also be found in agave plants. And I called him and I said, well, how can we engage with this material? To what extent could it be torsional, soft, or hard? And he said there's different ways that we can actually manipulate this material. So I put a use case to him and said it would be interesting to design a pair of sneakers made from wood. So a bioeconomical sneaker, you can see the tongue there is translucent. The idea is that the bulk of the material on the sneaker is actually made from wood fibers and bioeconomic technology. Even the base of the shoe, the rubber, not many people may know that at one point Brazil was one of the largest producers of rubber from trees. So the notion that a sole of a shoe has to be produced by petroleum products is not the case. You can actually think of a shoe that could be designed entirely using bioeconomic materials. I think this would be a great project for engineers and artists and architects to get on. Next slide. And of course, it's not just about furniture, but it can also be at the scale of the city. This was an image of a project, some of you may be familiar with it, which was pushing the idea of how can we reinvent architecture itself. So from the scale of the fork to the urban tower, is there a way in which a bio-based economy can allow us to engage with a new form of making our cities? Next slide. We have principles that are aligned to flow, but I won't read them now, but they begin to capture and make a sort of pledge about how we intend to live in harmony with nature by 2050, and we invite all to ask how do we do that together, designers, capitalists, community activists, legislators, and investors. Next slide. And in closing, today's discussion is about how do we move away from the past of open systems where we treated the planet as a hungry sewer for our development to one in which we see it as a circular opportunity for development, a regenerative approach in which all things are given their rightful space and their role in the planet. I'm a believer that in order for us to create the world that we would like to see for our children, it is inescapable that we have to engage in some sort of fashion with a bioeconomic approach. And with that, I thank you and would like to introduce my good colleague, Sellah Bogonko. Sellah is a co-founder, ally, friend, and CEO of Jacob's Ladder Africa, a youth focused organization on a mission to activate 30 million jobs in the green economy in Africa by 2033. Jacobs Ladder Africa works at the intersection of youth employment and climate change, seeking to solve both challenges through advocating and creating green jobs in Africa. JLA also runs the Africa Climate Ambassadors Program, of which I'm a proud member, aimed at increasing the range and number of voices advocating for the climate opportunity narrative in Africa. I want to welcome you to the stage and also say I am particularly grateful for what I believe is an important conversation on this theme of partnerships in order to achieve the aims that you have set out. Please.
So unfortunately or fortunately, I don't have a song to go with my presentation, but I think we'll make do with it. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. As you heard, my name is Sellah Bogonko. I am co-founder and CEO Jacobs Ladder Africa, and we are proud to be partnering with Coopers Union on this event. Jacobs Ladder Africa focuses on solving for two of the main challenges that we believe Africa is facing. On the one hand, we focus on solving for youth unemployment, and then on the other hand, we focus on solving for climate change. And when we brought those two together, we realized that one of the ways that we can effectively achieve our mission is focusing on creating and catalyzing green jobs in the green economy. And we do that in four main ways. The first one is skilling for unemployment, which basically means we create increased awareness on the skills that are required and making sure that these young people have the actual skills for the green transition that everyone is talking about. The second way in which we do that is through entrepreneurship development. And the third way is what we call intrapreneurship development, meaning that we understand that there are young people, especially the Gen Zs in the room, you'd resonate with this. There are young people who don't want the burden of being an entrepreneur, thinking about the capital and building a team, etc. And they also don't want the responsibility of being an employee. And so we basically create this way in which we deploy large programs and then are able to effectively engage young people across the value chain. The last way in which we solve for youth unemployment and climate change is through climate advocacy, which is part of the Ambassadors Program. The Africa Climate Ambassadors Program is part of that way in which we advocate for green jobs, advocate for the climate, the opportunity basically that we see that Africa can take advantage of as far as climate change is concerned. I'm excited, like I said earlier. Thank you, Mokena, for this opportunity for us to partner together. And as Mokena mentioned, he is one of our members in the Africa Climate Ambassadors Program, which is one of the programs that we run under our advocacy pillar. We also have two of our ambassadors here, Wanjiru Kamau-Rutenberg and Serah Makka. You'll get to hear them. They will be on the panel this evening. They're brilliant. They are doing amazing work in the climate space, and you'll get to hear some of the work that they're doing. Before I take my seat, I'd like to share just two thoughts that I have regarding the bioeconomy. But before that, I also want to acknowledge James Mwangi. For those of you who don't know James, we call him the rock star when it comes to advocating for climate action on the continent. And one of the things that I personally appreciate about James is that as he continues to get into these rooms and push down this conversation, or rather champion for Africa's position at these tables, he's made it his mission to make sure that he doesn't go in alone. He brings all of us along that journey to be able to advocate for the opportunity that we see. And so before I take my seat, I'd just like to share two reflections on this evening's topic. The first one being that I believe that Africa's bioeconomy needs to have a value chain approach and a systems thinking approach to realize the highest returns, and specifically in terms of job creation. In Kenya, where I come from, we have this big project that was launched by our president, which is focused on planting 15 billion trees. And unfortunately, that program is largely focused on the planting of trees. But imagine if that all the investment, all the resources, all the efforts going towards that kind of program was focused on a more systemic and a value chain approach to it, from the seedlings all the way to the value-added products that come at the end of the day in terms of growing trees. That would create a significant number of jobs. And so for us to tap into the bioeconomy, I believe that we need to change the approach or focus more on a systems approach. The second one is, I believe that to reap the benefits of the bioeconomy, we must focus on building indigenous knowledge. I was recently introduced to a herbal doctor. And for those that are not from Africa, don't worry, this is not the woo kind of doctor. This is actually an MD, trained doctor who decided to focus his energy and his practice on using nature for healing. And when I went there, the doctor assessed me and was able to detect things, in terms of my health indicators and prescribe solutions that have helped me improve on my personal health indicators, all based on nature. You can imagine how many people that I've had to drag along, my family and friends, to be able to visit the same doctors, and some of them had even early detection of things that the mainstream doctors were not able to pick. And this kind of indigenous knowledge is often looked upon as uncivilized, and something that is not necessarily approved or recognized as an actual source of income or livelihood, but on the other hand, not necessarily considered as something that should be encouraged. And yet, for us to encourage the bioeconomy, we not only have to encourage these kinds of methods of building the indigenous knowledge, but we have to be able to focus on the discovery of that knowledge, the processing of that knowledge, the commercialization of that knowledge, and the value addition of that knowledge to be able to translate to creation of jobs at the grassroots. Because in contexts like Africa, the way we can create jobs based on what Mokena has elaborately explained this evening is by encouraging innovation. And innovation happens at the grassroots. And for that grassroots innovation to take place, we have to be able to build it on the backbone of indigenous knowledge. And so for this evening, I'd like to welcome you, in partnership, of course, with Coopers Union, welcome you and hope that we will all be able to learn a thing or two, and not just learn, but be able to take this message out there that there is a whole different way in which we can create jobs on the one part and solve for climate change on the other. Asanteni sana, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sellah. At this point, I would like to introduce a friend, a colleague, an ally in change, James Irungu Mwangi, who's giving us the keynote. James is the founder and CEO of Africa Climate Ventures, where he's working to help build and accelerate transformative, climate-smart and carbon-negative businesses across the continent. An inaugural member of the Rockefeller Foundation Climate Advisory Council, yes, Mwangi is also the founder of the Climate Action Platform Africa, a nonprofit organization that works to help unlock Africa's potential as a global hub for climate action. As James comes to the stage, one of the things I wanted to say about him, which is just in addition to the reflections of my good colleague Sellah, the remarkable thing about James, I think, is his ability to draw connections across boundaries, across communities, and across locations. I've had the pleasure of having conversations with him in Nairobi, here in New York, elsewhere, and around the world, and many people sing his praises. We are really privileged to have him here, where he can share his thoughts, and in particular bring this discussion, which has been in part centered on the question of Africa's potential, but to bring it about why is Africa important to the world, and why that is a meaningful opportunity for change and impact. James, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Mokena, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this august occasion and this dialogue. It's a real privilege to be standing up here. I will, however, acknowledge that my task seems to have been made somewhat more difficult than I had earlier expected, in two ways. The first of which is the excessive over-promising that makes it very difficult to over-deliver from the very generous comments of both Sellah and Mokena. And the second thing is, as you've seen, they have covered a lot of very thoughtful ground in their opening remarks. I was sitting there with my points and going, nope, not that, that's gone. Can't say that, they've covered it. So bear with me as I offer not so much a set of remarks or a direction that you haven't heard before, but perhaps a provocation as we think about how to go beyond net zero and how to think about the bioeconomy, and in particular Africa, if you'll grant me the privilege of a little bit of home bias. The first thing I will say is, we're here during the UN General Assembly Week, New York Climate Week, and if you look around, you'll observe that Africa pops up in conversation in New York perhaps more than it does on the average week. But it pops up in a very particular set of ways. One is Africa, in the climate discussion, there's a dialogue about Africa as a victim of climate change, recognizing the fact that Africa has had Africa and Africans, the continent itself, of course, is a landmass like any other, but Africa's people have played a disproportionately small role in creating the surge of emissions that has driven that terrifying curve up, particularly from the 1950s to where we find ourselves today. And yet, by virtue of holding the largest portion of the world's tropical real estate, which has certain characteristics as we begin to encounter the consequences of climate change, Africa is feeling some of the earliest and most severe effects of those emissions. So didn't cause it, as a result did not get wealthy from causing it, and facing some of the highest impacts of it, which are further complicating the process of generating dignified livelihoods and building inclusive and prosperous economies. The other way that Africa pops up in the climate discussion, other than the very clear climate justice case that I and my fellow inhabitants of the continent have to the rest of the world, is as a passive host. There is the note that Africa is home to the Congo Basin and many other natural assets. Indeed, it is the world's last remaining healthy lung. What I mean by that is, while the Amazon rainforest and the rainforest of Indonesia and across Southeast Asia are major parts of the global climatic balance, all of those assets are now net emitters. They are so damaged that they are now releasing more carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than they are removing. It is only really the Congo Basin among the mega lungs of the world that is still a net remover, but given the pressures on it, I would say, unfortunately, watch this space. So there's Africa as a passive host. Africans being asked, well, just leave this alone, leave this one asset well enough alone. Oh, and by the way, sorry for the fact that you are facing all of these impacts. Let's talk about whether there's some modest compensation that the world can scratch up. The second type of conversation you will hear, other than the climate conversation, is the conversation around the SDGs and the progress towards 2030. And there, Africa is discussed as the productivity laggard of the agriculture is less productive than the global mean. We have 60% of the world's uncultivated land. I'm not sure, that it's really uncultivated. It's land that's still left in its natural state for the most part. Or the 600 million Africans who still lack access to modern energy, many of whom are also cooking with biomass, charcoal and firewood that is bad for health and terrible for deforestation. So the image that you get is one that centers Africa, but centers Africa as a place of challenge and problem. None of that is necessarily untrue. And it is also happening in the context, if you've been paying attention to all of the headlines this week, of a planet that is falling behind on job one since the Paris Agreement, which was get to net zero by 2050. The countries that we know that there's still a number of countries that have said very clearly we cannot, given the imperative of delivering dignified livelihoods for our people, get to net zero before 2060 or 2070. We know that the rich world, the wealthiest countries in the world, did make promises to get to net zero by 2050, but anyone who's paid attention to the headlines about the rise of data centers, the promises to drill, baby, drill, and so on, will know we are behind where we need to be in honoring those obligations. And so what does that mean? It means that we're not on track to stay below 1.5 or even 2 degrees of warming. Overshoot out of the comfortable range within which humanity has evolved is almost guaranteed. This is a very cheerful conversation. But perhaps we can reframe it. And we can reframe it by recognizing that Africa is not just a passive victim and passive host. It also has a lot of potential, the basis of which has already been outlined. This is the point in my talk that I would normally throw out a bunch of statistics about Africa as the fastest growing population, the hub of the 21st century's big surge of urbanization, and. But a lot of that point has been made. I will say that if we look instead at Africa's population, that surging population that will account for 1 in 4 human beings in the not too distant future, and ask how they could contribute to a climate positive, bioeconomy driven model of the planet, then we may get a sense of excitement, in addition to the recognition of challenge and responsibility. We may, for example, recognize that if those Africans, who already on a per capita basis have the lowest emissions of any human beings on planet Earth, were to improve their standards of living without increasing their emissions intensity. It's not an easy task. No one else has managed to do it. But the technologies and the tools exist, whether it's renewable energy, whether it is an embrace of clean cooking that uses sustainable biomass, whether it is embracing regenerative agriculture, whether it is that 40% of all global urban construction by 2050 that could go from being a net emitter in terms of the choice of materials. Concrete and steel actually are arguably a questionable approach to building in the hot tropics, and could instead become a net sink for carbon, would be a huge contribution. So greening Africa's own consumption. But why stop there? If you have the world's largest workforce, its largest untapped natural resources, and its largest endowments of renewable energy, why would you not make Africa's bioeconomy an exporter to the world? We are looking at a world which needs to move to regenerative agricultural practices to feed itself, but backing up once you've already established an existing set of agricultural practices is difficult. You have vested interests, you have established practices and infrastructure. And yet Africa languishes in low productivity just as we are re-embracing the power of regenerative methods. Embracing those to drive up productivity and drive an agriculture that is not just producing quality food and products, but is also sequestering greenhouse gases durably within our soils and in our crops. This holds the promise of turning agriculture from being a source of problem and the world's farmers from being a challenge to meeting net zero to being a source of opportunity, and indeed turning Africa from a net importer of food into the breadbasket, the sustainable and regenerative breadbasket of the future. And then finally, in recognizing that, yes, we are going to, in all likelihood, overshoot our carbon budget, which is a narrow way to think about the bounty that nature provides, but an important one nonetheless. We are going to overshoot, and getting back to balance requires harnessing a range of tools and levers, not least among which is the power of nature, both in terms of maintaining and restoring our existing natural carbon sinks, the mangroves, the grasslands, the rainforests, the woodlands of Africa, in thinking really deeply about how we maximize the carbon yield of agriculture, which I've already talked about, and in going beyond that to hybrid approaches that harness solutions such as enhanced rock weathering to manage our soil acidity in our farms while removing carbon from the atmosphere, or embrace the power of biochar to really give back nutrients to the soil and durably store carbon. Estimates from some of the work of the Climate Action Platform Africa suggest that if we were willing to value the work of providing climate services. And I use that term advisedly because carbon credit seems a meager term for what we're really talking about here. But if we were to really value these services, and let's pick a number. Right now the marginal cost of abatement in industrial sectors in Europe is about $90 to $100 a ton, or 100 euros a ton, and probably should be more than that. But even at $30 a ton, you could create something like 40 million jobs and be removing 600 million tons of carbon dioxide using nature in Africa annually for quite an ongoing duration. That is a non-trivial portion of what we need to do to begin the process of reversing the impacts of climate change. And most excitingly, and to Sellah's point earlier, it begins to mobilize those millions of young people, saying to them, you are not the world's climate victims. You are the workforce the world has been looking for. You're not passive hosts of the world's natural bounty. You're its active stewards, trained in managing and maintaining it, not just for future generations, but for current generations' benefit. And finally, you're the entrepreneurs, innovators, and technologists who are designing the solutions that will save the planet. That seems to me a better message, both for the giver of the message and the recipient, and one that can harmonize us all in pursuit of a climate-positive growth. So I perhaps leave us there with that challenge and that invitation to think about the challenge before us differently, as one of mobilization to a new way rather than just resistance of an old one, and of recognizing the opportunity that exists in those who have been excluded and in unlocking their potential to contribute to a transformation that we all can benefit from. Thank you for your time and your attention. And thank you.
Thank you, James, for a wonderful presentation and to put things into context. And I could not ask for a better segue to the next portion of the evening. You raised the challenge about the role of innovators and creation, and I would like to use this moment to say we're going to have two showcased projects, one from the Cooper Union and one from Namibia. With that, I'd like to introduce you to the Cooper Union Decathlon Design Challenge Grand Prize winning team, and a round of applause for them and Professor Melody Baglioni. As they come up to the stage, I'd like to say a few things. One of the ways Cooper Union prepares our students for the bioeconomy and addressing the climate crisis through net zero pathways is through a new vertically integrated projects or VIP core structure. The VIP core structure promotes interdisciplinary initiatives in which students work on large-scale projects or collegiate competitions. Our Solar Decathlon VIP team competes in the United States Department of Energy Solar Decathlon Design Challenge, in which architecture and engineering students work together to design high-performance, low-carbon buildings that mitigate climate change and improve our quality of life through greater affordability, resilience, and energy efficiency. The 2023 team competed in front of a jury of industry experts at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, and presented their design for the extension and renovation of the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School on Governor's Island, promoting zero-energy retrofit principles and workforce development opportunities for the community. Rising to the top of a talented group of 55 competing teams from around the world, the Cooper Union team took first place in the Education Building Division and the grand prize in the overall commercial category. And I have to give you a round of applause again. Part of the Cooper Union's winning Solar Decathlon team are here today to present their grand prize-winning finale presentation. I introduce to you Tate Liang, a fifth-year architecture student, Amelia Rupnarin, a senior mechanical engineering student, and Larry Zeng, a junior civil engineering student. The floor is yours.
Hello, we are the Cooper Union Solar Decathlon team, and we are here to present the reimagining of the New York Harbor School, situated between the Hudson and East River. Specifically, the school focuses on maritime research for its students, and they are all in different socioeconomic statuses. Next slide, please. The project goals that we wanted to cover when we met with the principal of the school was that we wanted to expand the facilities, make a gym and a pool, and also make sure that the students still have access to their maritime focus. Next slide.
Let's take a look at the site for our project. So you can see in the diagram on the right, we have an existing school building 550 and also a building 555, which is currently abandoned, which we plan to renovate. And we also have an adjacent triangular lot where we plan to create a new academic building for the students. The images on the left, you can see the current condition of the school where the basement of building 555 is flooded. And our strategy is essentially to remove these worn out roads and conditions and create a more unified campus experience. Next slide. For the program for our school, we have, in this rendering, you can see a boardwalk that leads to a public outdoor learning space, which also ends up leading to a roof garden for the students. Next. And the classrooms include labs and also other learning spaces, such as unconditioned buffer zone, which has openable panels in the summer. And we also have these community gathering spaces in the hallways, which turn them also into places of exchange.
Our landscape design uses a cut and fill strategy, where excavation and construction debris fills a flooded basement of building 555. To secure essential programs, the building and boardwalk were elevated 12 feet above the ground, and all critical systems were located above the 500-year floodplain, allowing the elevated gym to serve as a community shelter during extreme weather events. Next slide. Here we see our bathtub-style foundation system with monolithic pours and waterproofing to reduce stagnant saltwater near the foundation and surrounded by native salt-tolerant plants to prevent erosion. Next slide. Our building is designed to... Oh.
Sorry. The mechanical systems within the architecture of this building are heavily integrated, from the roof with a 40-degree tilt facing south and the direct vertical skylights that illuminate the gym and the pool underneath, but also have an open area for the green roof, allowing light for both the green roof and the outdoor spaces. There is also CO2 monitoring in each space, as well as the earth below being a sink and source for our energy piles. Next slide. Our energy piles and sinking coils put us at the 99.6 percentile for our peak heating load, and there's also additional air source heat pumps below to compensate for any other need. Next slide. Our integrated roof, the sawtooth roof spoken about before, collects 92% more electricity than the building needs, and all of the excess electricity goes back to the grid. In energy emergencies, such as blackouts, we can disconnect from the grid and be self-sufficient for 3 days, pulling from our battery. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about the classrooms for the new academic building. Next slide, please. So in the winter, we both have an active and passive model. Within the passive, the lower sun angle heats the thermal mass within the floors of the building and heats the classrooms and the hallways. And in the active setting, there's also radiant panels both in the floor and ceiling that also, again, heats that ambient space of the classroom and the hallways. Next slide.
The pool and the gym are also extremely important for the school because they provide the spaces for physical activity and athletics. Next slide. During the winter, in the active mode, there's both radiant floor heating for the pool and the gym, and we also have a hydronic heat recovery system to collect the hot, humid air from the pool. Additionally, we have ceiling fans that reduce air stratification and south-facing windows that capture solar radiation for passive heating.
Next slide. Using the Climate Studio extension in Rhino, we were able to calculate that there is an 89% spatial daylight autonomy within the building, both for the entire new academic building. This means that the design of the building with the skylights allows there to be a 32% energy saving with the electricity bill for this new academic building. Next slide. Building 555, as spoken about previously, is a historic landmark, so we could only do renovations within the interior of the building. Next slide. Here is a section of what that looks like, both in heating and cooling. We use the existing chimney within the space to be a solar chimney, so just retrofitting that and making sure that there is natural ventilation throughout the space. In the active setting, there's also radiant ceiling panels and radiant floor panels, and all emergency systems are located on the 3rd floor for resiliency purposes. Next slide. All of these design choices bring us next to our energy analysis. Next slide. So you can see that the entire campus source EUI is 51, which is very good in my opinion, or in our opinion. There's also a Sankey diagram that shows the split between the new academic building and the retrofit. The pool is the major consumer of the energy, followed by the gym, classroom, and lab spaces. With this energy intensive program, there is still, the new academic building still falls within a good range comparative to the rest of the secondary schools within the same climate zone. Next slide. Speaking of, the PV is what gets us there. With everything being said, all buildings, those 3 buildings within the campus are net zero and all electrified. This puts our source EUI at -15, meaning that we're always selling back to the grid with our full battery system in emergency settings. Next slide.
The NAB is 85% less carbon intensive than comparative structures built with concrete. Excess electricity generated by our PV panels will offset the entire project's carbon footprint within 10 years, making this entire project carbon negative in the long term. Next slide. The estimated cost for our project totals $805 per square foot, which is well within 5% of the School Construction Authority's predicted budget for similar structures. Next slide. Our project uses unique approaches to achieve a net zero, cutting-edge, carbon-neutral design that intertwines both cutting-edge and time-tested technologies. It is a model for sustainable design, inspiring future leaders dedicated to climate and social justice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Every time I see that presentation, I learn something new. Congratulations to the team again. It sounds like I've got my first cohorts for the Flow design posse, so I'll be reaching out to you later. The next presentation is from Africa. I thought it was important to have a sort of bicontinental conversation about innovation in this space. And I'd like to introduce Kane Moffett from Kelp Blue. As he comes to the stage, I'll just read a short bio on this incredible individual, part of an incredible organization. He's originally from Scotland with a background in corporate finance for the food and agricultural sector. He's worked with companies to fund and build their operations in Asia, North America, Europe, and Africa by both raising capital and by developing operational plans. Currently, as the Group CFO for Kelp Blue, he's working to develop the seaweed industry across the globe. He spent a considerable amount of his time in Namibia at their project site in Luderitz. He's inspired by the natural world around us and all things ocean, and I think is an excellent addition to the evening. Take to the floor, Kane. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Mokena, and also very well done to the project team for the incredible and inspiring presentation we just saw. So, I am nowhere near as eloquent as the other speakers, nor as inspiring as the project team, so I can at least be brief. So, in Kelp Blue, effectively what we do is we cultivate giant kelp at scale, we trim the top of the forest every year, and then we produce sustainable seaweed-based products. So very much in line with Mokena's earlier points on unlocking the potential of bio-based products. The first of our products is a biostimulant, and this is for farmers such that they can use onto their crops and then reduce the implementation of chemical-based fertilizers. So we can really see the benefit in the ocean of the carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and overall resilience of the ocean, but then this very nice synergy where we can improve the soil and the long-term health of the crops as well. We do operate globally, so we are a Dutch company with operations in Namibia, New Zealand, and Alaska, but Namibia really is the heart of where we operate. It's the best place on the planet climatologically to grow this species of seaweed, but also the innovation, the governance, just the future and ambition of the Namibian country really is why we're there as well. We operate, as Mokena said, in a little town called Luderitz. We always tell people, you go to Windhoek, you drive for 12 hours through the desert to the end of the world, and then you go a little bit further. So, as Mokena said, we need to start looking at living within our planetary boundaries. but we also need to start looking at how do we tweak our existing utilization of bio-based products and implement them into our supply chain. This does require innovation. And just as seaweed is abundant in Namibia, we're seeing innovation popping up all over the country and all over the continent of Africa as well. So I'm going to step aside, and there's going to be 2 videos here. They will tell the story far better than I ever could. The first one is about Kelp Blue's business in general, but the second one is a very interesting innovation that we've been working on, and it addresses a specific problem on our business, which is how do you harvest kelp on a very large scale without going back in time of having a larger carbon footprint. So we've tried to balance the economics of our business plus the carbon side of our business, and I think you'll find it quite interesting what we've put together.
Meet kelp, giant kelp. At Kelp Blue, we're cultivating this extraordinary seaweed to play an outsized role in capturing carbon and helping to combat climate change, while providing a huge boost to the marine ecosystem. Our cultivated kelp forests capture CO2 from the atmosphere and the ocean, storing it in the deep ocean layers. Let us show you how. We start at the very beginning. This is a piece of soros tissue, the fertile material that is found on mature kelp blades, these flat, leaf-like structures. This tissue is taken to our hatchery, a safe and controlled environment where we nurture the kelp from near microscopic gametophytes through to sporophytes, the multicellular leaf-like stage. Once big enough, the sporophytes are attached to a special twine and made ready to be planted in the ocean. At the outplanting stage, the twine is wrapped around our farm structures. In the wild, kelp uses hard substrates such as rocks on which to grow. Our farm uses lines and ropes onto which the holdfast, the root-like foot of the kelp, can securely attach. The farms are submerged in the ocean. In the shallower waters, the kelp grows directly from the ocean floor. In the deeper water, we have installed structures that are anchored at around 15 meters below the surface, the perfect depth to maximize access to nutrients and light, while keeping the young kelp out of the most violent movement of the waves. Each structure, approximately the size of 3 tennis courts, is designed to move in harmony with the forces of the ocean. In a few months, the kelp will start appearing at the surface where it forms a floating canopy. Giant kelp is one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet, growing up to 50 centimeters per day. With this fast growth, the kelp quickly absorbs carbon from the surrounding waters and stores it in its tissues. Some of the kelp naturally dies off and drifts away to be cycled into deeper ocean layers. Kelp also exudes dissolved organic matter, very small particles, including carbon. Our modelling shows that currents sweep the carbon from the kelp away from the coast and into the deep ocean. Once it reaches the deeper ocean layers, it remains undisturbed for a very long time, long enough to have a significant effect on tackling climate change. But the environmental benefit of kelp forests is not just about carbon capture. These ecosystems also host many species that make the kelp forests their home. Kelp is considered a foundation species, meaning it has a role in structuring a marine community. Every month since our farms have been growing, we've seen new species visiting and making homes on our structures. Our dedicated marine monitoring team regularly check on the kelp and keep track of the biodiversity observed. They use a range of different methods, including active and passive acoustics, visual observations, lab analyses of water samples, and environmental DNA. We also constantly measure the water quality and send samples to a lab to measure the content of the dissolved organic carbon exuded by the kelp. Once the kelp grows to maturity and starts forming a canopy, some of the biomass is harvested to turn into sustainable alternatives for industries such as agriculture and packaging. Currently, the kelp is harvested by hand, but we have commissioned a fully automated, solar-powered, emission-free harvester, which will allow us to significantly scale up our operations. Our 3,500-ton capacity processing factory converts kelp biomass into essential products that also have a positive effect on the environment. Our first product is a biostimulant, a liquid kelp extract that helps boost the immune system of crops and plants, making them more resilient to environmental stresses such as drought and heat, as well as helping them produce bigger yields. By 2030, Our goal is to have over 6,500 hectares of seaweed installed across Namibia, New Zealand, Alaska, and Chile, and to sell over 35 million litres of biostimulant, aiding over 200,000 farmers to transition towards regenerative agriculture. Our offshore technology allows for large-scale deployment, and our solution is easily replicated in other locations around the world. At Kelp Blue, we often ask ourselves, how do we want the world to look in 200 years? Then we try to ensure that everything we do contributes to building that vision. Together we can build that better world. We just need to take the first step.
So right now we're in the Namport facilities in Nudrets, and you can really see a flurry of activity behind me. It's the team, as usual, always up to lots of exciting work.
It's never been done before. It's the first of its kind, not only in Africa but in the whole world.
Basically what happened today is we put one of the biggest structures ever lifted by Kelp Blue, 30 tons in total. Yeah, I was quite nervous first, but we got it done, as always.
Everyone came to see, because it's the first time getting into the water, and then you see how it will maneuver, you know. Yeah.
Two very exciting projects, and I'm also happy to say that Professor Melody Baglioni, who was involved with the students, reached out to me and said that she would love to look at a collaboration between Kelp Blue and Cooper Union, given the intersectionality on the issue of the bioeconomy. So we will see how that goes, but already the CPL is starting to do its work for global cooperation, which is really exciting. We've now come to the part of the evening where the conversation begins. We started out from a theoretical framing. Now we're at that point is up having conversations with our esteemed colleagues, and I'd like them to come up in no particular order. I'll read the bios when they're all seated. Welcome, 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 welcome. David Hertz is a visionary social entrepreneur and global influencer known for his ability to transform realities through gastronomy. I've also known you for a number of years. I think we were last on a panel, was it in Tokyo 2017? I think it was then. I was talking about cities and urbanization. You were talking about food, and I think we clicked, and I said, one day I want to work with you. You are the founder of Gastromotiva, and your organization has had a huge impact in a number of countries, from Brazil, including Africa, and you delve into the question of local food systems to promote dignity and inclusion. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much, and congratulations for what I've seen here from you and all the speakers. I've learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Dr. Wanjiru, she's a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation, as well as founder and CEO of Black Women in Executive Leadership. Be well. Bringing both a food systems and social inclusion approach to addressing climate change, she previously served as Director of African Women in Agricultural Research and Development, which works towards inclusive agriculture-driven prosperity for the African continent with more gender-responsive agricultural research and innovation. And let me confess that Dr. Wanjiru and I had a chat, and I was told I need to change a few of my slides. You enhance them through your commentary. Thank you so much. Welcome to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Serah is the Africa Executive Director of the One campaign. One is a global, nonpartisan organization fighting for a more just world by demanding the investments needed to create economic opportunities and healthier lives in Africa. You have over 19 years as a global development professional. You've worked in the United States, Afghanistan, and Nigeria, and you've managed a $10 million facility to develop low-income products and services to deepen financial inclusion in Nigeria. I could go on, but thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
James, I've already had the pleasure of describing your background, but I will say again, welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
And Mae-Ling Lokko is an architectural scientist, designer, and educator focused on the intersectoral design and research of bio-based materials to drive ecological health and generative justice goals. She's assistant professor at Yale School of Architecture, where she teaches environmental design and the history of contemporary design of bio-based building technologies. I'd like to jump into the bio there and say we had a wonderful conversation about how we reframe and use the right types of language to describe the sort of challenges that we're finding, and to also center a sensibility that's really about locating people first in terms of how we think of these challenges. And I thank you for your contribution in that regard. I'd like to also add that I believe you're the co-author of that recent publication, a partnership between Yale and the United Nations, a fantastic piece of work which I've given to my students to have a look at. I also particularly enjoyed the Africa section. It's one of the most profound reads in terms of understanding the potential of a different way of being and a different way of constructing and imagining carbon in construction. So I'm exceptionally grateful to have you here tonight. I luckily might be able to sit on the corner there because I think speaking from the podium here makes me feel more of a game show host than a participant. But there might be some money at the end of the night. So my first question, and we've had some of these discussions. I'd like to maybe put this to you, David, because you raised a very good point. I mean, you practice mainly in Brazil. I know you've done some work in Africa, but your provocation about the bioeconomy and social gastronomy, what does that mean? And are there lessons to be learned in your experience? And how can we bring what you know to this audience right now? And I'll sit on the end there.
Okay, so good afternoon again. I'm from Brazil, and I'm a chef. So for 20 years, I've been working on this concept of social gastronomy. If anyone knows José Andrés aqui, Chef José Andrés, he's been doing that a lot. It starts with feeding people, but it's how this kitchen can be a place to build empowerment, belonging, and financial autonomy. So there are many ways to tackle that, and for these 20 years, we know that education is the key. We train more than 10,000 people in Brazil, Mexico, El Salvador, and South Africa. And after seeing with time, 5, 10 years, these chefs or social entrepreneurs or food entrepreneurs, mostly coming from favelas, slums, urban indigenous communities, they are thriving. When we met and you spoke about Japan, we partnered with Chef Massimo Bottura. He's Italian chef, very well known, and he created these concepts of refeitório. That is the refeitório Harlem here, who wants to go. So we only cook with food surplus, and we feed the hunger. So just to put some numbers here, in Brazil, there are 8.4 million people that don't know what they're gonna eat or when they're gonna eat again. And more than 40% of the population is under food insecurity. But we waste 8 times more than we could feed all those 8.4 million. And the hidden cost on infrastructure, on health, it's 544 billion in our economy. So we are talking here about some problems, but we think the kitchen and the food system, as we've seen here in a few pieces, they are key elements to be transformed towards climate change. And we face climate injustice. So we always worked with social injustice in urban areas, but with COVID, we built those kitchens in our former students' house, and we opened 150 kitchens all over Brazil. And that got me to the Amazon, took me to the Amazon for the first time. And the city of Manaus in the state of Amazonas, the second biggest city after Belém, where the COP will be next year, has an industrial model that has been working there since the 60s and is not prepared for this new economy. But last time I went there, no, last year, the last time I went there last year, the city was under smoke. The whole state was under smoke because of fire for 3 months. And I was attending at TEDx with water there and air conditioning, and we were hearing the problems from the people who live outside in the forest or in their villages around the forest, saying, in our village, we don't even have water to drink. So the point that I want to get is like, after working many years in urban areas, favelas or very low-income communities, when we got to the Amazon, we started to learn about the bioeconomy, the products from the forest. But in order to get there in the market, what everybody's saying, we need to listen to the communities and how they want to protect those places, because the ingredients are either for food, cosmetics, whatever fashion they're going to use. It needs to be connected to the dreams of the community. So I can talk more about that.
Nope.
But for me,
It's a good
education
point.
is the key.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point to segue, because I think community is a big part of this evening. And Dr. Wanjiru, I know that we spoke a bit about community. Would you like to expand a bit more about what are the ways in which we can actually center community involvement in these solutions, and any experiences you think might be relevant for us to know?
Yeah, no, and again, thanks so much for having me. My thought is really simple. I think it's important to be careful to not use big fancy words to describe what African and African communities have been doing for a really long time. And I really appreciated Mwangi's opening remarks about where we've come from, and that reality of Africa not having have contributed to the mess that we're in. I think it's really, okay. This might get me in trouble, but you know how...
You're with friends here, so it's okay.
Massive audience. Okay. You know how when the US states have started passing cannabis laws, legalizing cannabis, yet there's still people in jail who have been imprisoned when cannabis was illegal in those states. And what we're also seeing is those who have access to the resources, the capital, to build new cannabis businesses don't look like those who are in jail under old anti-cannabis laws. If we are not careful, we're gonna, the bioeconomy, the language of the bioeconomy has a risk of exacerbating already existing inequalities that were created in the imperial period, in the colonial period. Yeah. And so I urge care, even as we embrace fancy new terms. Who has already been there, building in ways that are sustainable, feeding communities in ways that are sustainable, and who are we plowing under in our rush to rebrand those ancient practices as bioeconomy practices?
Yep. Thank you. May, I know that you've worked on the continent and you've worked here, and I think part of this conversation resonates with our previous conversation. What are your reflections on the challenge of recognizing previous practices and locating them where they need to be dignified in terms of how we move forward?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Wanjiru and Mokena. I think there's a huge revolution happening now, a lot of positive aspects that are driving renewed interest in bio-based materials, building materials specifically. And, you know, I started doing a lot of my work looking at the byproduct of the coconut food and cosmetic industry. Like Brazil, we produce a ton of husks byproduct. They're incredibly strong, tensile fibers. If you mill the husk, you get a fantastic dust-like substance called pith, which is a fantastic glue. But years on, we realized that in our enthusiasm for finding all sorts of pathways, and there are millions of pathways for natural fibers relative to mineral-based technologies like concrete and steel, we're incentivizing the scale up of monocultures. And so, you know, one of the things that we do today is really think about, you know, how do we promote biodiverse building materials? And also, yes, indigenous practices around soil conservation have been fantastic. There are also gender and child labor patterns that are deeply integrated in the domestic and family life cycle, very difficult to shift. And if, you know, your projections are right on the mark, the building sector material demand is going to be massive in terms of its impact on agriculture, and we can risk exacerbating those patterns. And so for me, actually a lot of inspiration has come from industries that are actually dealing with waste byproducts. Plastic industry in Africa is setting the model for how we collect distributed waste resources around the city. We're also seeing electronic waste and textile waste upcycling. All these sort of skill transfers between all these waste industries are also things that the biomass industry is starting to look at. And this is predominantly with African youth that are leading the way because they have to, and they have entrepreneurial you know, goals with that. So a lot of the work that we've tried to do frames what we call generative justice, which is really thinking about bottom-up value addition and justice in terms of now that we recognize all of the value that different stakeholders that were previously invisible, from urban farmers to active cooperatives, that there's an opportunity to return value and circulate the profits that we're getting from high-value applications. And so that aspect of generative justice has been key in the way we work, but it's also been an important methodology for actually asking who do we work with first of all, where's all the alienated value in this system? Because if we begin there, we actually get to the root causes, you know, of some of the injustices we see in our material economy.
Very useful. Thank you. I'd like to build on this thread, and but pivot slightly. But bearing in mind, it's actually building on this point. Serah, your work has been also about the question of health and healthy societies. May has raised the question of how, let's call it, labor chains in unlocking these opportunities might be very problematic for domestic environments, children, etc., and women also. When you frame health, could you expand a bit for us, because it's such a wide and interesting topic, but I do think that it's often forgotten as a critical delivery point for how we think about economic development in cities around the world. So,
thanks, Mokena. Thanks for having me at this panel. You know, one of the things that Africa as a continent, the journey we're on, is to ensure that we create our own vaccines and develop our pharmaceutical industries. Africa currently imports 98.9% of diagnostics medication it uses. And we saw the exposure we had during COVID, because when the vaccines didn't come at the right time, we were kind of left holding the bag, as it were. So there's a journey from the African Union for us to, by 2040, to increase that 1% manufacturing space that we have to 40% of the products we have manufactured internally. And so it strikes me that it's a very important time in the history of Africa's manufacturing to include this conversation about the bioeconomy. Wanjiru mentioned earlier that sometimes we can forget what our forefathers have been doing in this new lexicon or providing a different frame to it. I was in a panel this week and they were asking me a story of what makes me think of Africa, what quantifies Africa from my own story lens. And I remember my grandmother when she was alive. Right now, when I come to her, when I have a tummy ache, I just take Pepto-Bismol. But when I was with her in the village, she would say, take that leaf over there and that leaf over there, boil it, drink it, your tummy ache will be gone. What we haven't done is codify that, and we haven't scaled it. But in our journey to create a health sovereignty in some ways, I think there's an opportunity for us to include plants, biodiversity, biomass in that building. And because Africa is really starting from scratch in that journey. So there's strong impetus for us. But I think the question is, we need some advocacy to push the actors, the researchers, the R&D, the scientists, to ensure that once we're going the path of creating healthier lives for Africans, we're not disregarding the knowledge and the supplies and the gifts that we have internally to make this manufacturing sector a lot more planet-friendly, quite frankly, better for our health, and healthier for our population.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I also like how you raised some of the challenges that we faced in terms of equitable access to things such as vaccine, and some of the challenges and steps that were taken by Africans to counter those sorts of problems. What I would like to do is to maybe tie the conversation together, and I'll pivot to you, James. I'm just giving you a bit of a heads up, is how do we make these arguments cogent and coherent in such a way that capital is attracted to the opportunities that we're seeing in the African continent? How do we drive the conversation in such a way that capital that is within the African continent gets deployed in the ways that we would like to see and is not used for nefarious purposes? And the third part, you don't have to answer all three, that can be shared, but the third part is what is the prospect or opportunity or use case, if you will, for partnerships between Africa and other parts of the world? We've seen the Kelp Blue project, which I think is fascinating in that regard as an example. There could be more which we could have spoken about. The question is, are we as Africans, able to address these challenges in isolation? And if not, what are the right types of partnerships to get us to where we need to be, where we're not in the passenger seat of our futures, but in fact at the driving seat and real stakeholders and shareholders, if you will, in these sort of green economic futures. So I know you've worked a bit in that world. And be straight. Tell us how it is on the other side of the room with all the people that you know. Yeah.
So first of all, if I'd known there'd be a test, I would have studied. But I think the question of how we attract capital and deploy capital responsibly is, I think, a central one. And regardless of, because at the end of the day, how we address problems is and the word capital itself comes loaded. So let me first say, we're saying how do we take the wealth and bounty of today and deploy it to, how do we use it as a seed for a better tomorrow in some way? No one does not want to do that. So when I say capital, I mean we all want to deploy the resources of today to get to the better outcomes of tomorrow. My first provocative statement is no one invests with, or rather investment is the game of the future, or deploying capital is a game of the future. It's a bet on a future outcome. Events in the past no longer can educate you, but they actually are not what you're betting on. You're betting on a future. And Africa is a heck of a place to be betting on the future because it is the continent of the future. Anyone who's thinking about the world of the future has to be thinking predominantly or quite disproportionately about Africa because that's where the future lives, the youngest continent on earth. And we need to reconcile that with a recognition that if you're growing up in Africa, you do spend a lot of time frustrated by the present and the ways in which it falls short of our past. Right? The ways that we lived in harmony with nature, the remedies, the approaches, and so on. We recognize that frustration and that longing for a better time behind us, but the challenge is, how do we articulate an exciting future? There's a reason why, as those of us who are part of the Tutu Fellows will remember, there's a reason why the rear view mirror in your car is a lot smaller than your windshield. It's important to know what's behind you. When you're driving, it's really important to see what's ahead. And so what is it that I think we need to do more of? And it does speak to how we relate with the rest of the world. I think we need to actually apply ourselves, not just to what are the unintended consequences we want to avoid. And I think those of us who are working in social justice and in climate are really aware of the unintended consequences of past actions. And it's good to be aware of them, but there's a danger of being paralyzed by that fear of unintended consequences. If my house is on fire, I will pour water on the fire. I do know that my carpets will be waterlogged and my basement might get mold, but the first thing I need to do is put out the fire. And there's a danger of a paralysis that we need to get past, and the way we get past it is really articulating clearly what is the future we want, rather than what are the aspects of the present that we don't want, which I think is where a lot of our conversation ends. So what does that mean? How do we embrace young insights into what they want to do? What's the future they want to see that they're genuinely excited about? That will involve, because human beings learn from everywhere, it will involve a synthesis and a fusion. There is no young African person I have seen who is only interested in ideas about the future of Africa that are just about returning to the past of Africa. It's about the best of what they have seen elsewhere, linked to things that they can uniquely bring. And that, interestingly, is how you create investable ideas that play to your particular and unique and distinctive advantage. So I think the big picture idea is, how do we paint a really exciting future, and a future we want to live in, and then we tend to try and tell the story of how we will solve our problems by starting from where we are today and what we'll do next year and the year after and the year after. The danger with that, it's like building a step ladder from where you are and trying to climb up. Step ladders can only take you so far. If you're trying to climb really far, you need to hang a rope ladder from the future you want to reach, and then ask, how high do you need to jump to catch the bottom rung of that rope ladder, and then you can climb the rest. So what is that future articulated clearly? What are the attributes of it in terms of the technologies we wanted to see, and so on and so forth? And how do we mobilize around that as a vision that can attract capital, partners, and insights in a way that allows us to get where we want to go?
Thank you, but I'd like to connect May and your last comment together, because embedded in what you're describing, and I fully agree, is this question of leadership. The report that May produced with United Nations was a heroic act of leadership. United Nations, Yale, and I think there's one form of leadership. You're talking about leadership of the imagination of sorts. I would like to know, to what extent can we say that does leadership nourished, supported on the African continent? What are the sort of infrastructures that can allow those type of imaginations to be catapulted and realized? Because some might argue that there is not enough leadership on the ground. And even to an extent, some would say that we need much more emphasis on state leadership in some of these conversations. And it's a provocation, not necessarily my position. So the role of institutions in driving this conversation. And you first, and then May.
Is that on? Oh, okay. I think that there is a massive opportunity, obviously, in the built environment. One of the things that the report that we published with UNEP sought out to do was to really put building materials on the climate agenda directly. And part of that process was actually taking specific bioregions around the world, looking at the major housing typologies. I led the team in West Africa, looking specifically at Ghana and Senegal, and evaluating if we were to replace all of the conventional building materials with bio-based, what would really be the impact? Because city, municipal, authorities and actors are setting decarbonization, plans in motion. And real estate is a huge, lever in terms of, capitalizing on all these gains. One of the shocking things from this report was that, the impact could be nil if we don't really take into consideration the whole life carbon equation. And so really thinking about that in the broadest terms, that bio-based materials could be a triple heavyweight in terms of affecting carbon, but also capital investments. And right now, we need bigger imaginations about entrepreneurship in the built environment. For example, if we're bringing in materials that are fantastic in terms of they're sequestering carbon as they're photosynthesizing, but we're actually postponing their carbon emissions because we don't prematurely burn them or we downcycle them early, and we store them instead in buildings as wonderful materials from CLT all the way to bio-based insulation. They also can affect the operational carbon of a building if designed and integrated properly. But instead, what we do is we pump these materials with glues, coatings. I call it Botox. Don't age, don't move, last forever. And that has huge impacts, in terms of carbon, but also toxicity. But where are the types of enterprises that can actually take these materials that are shorter life, but have maybe other transformation pathways after the building? It's almost like a carpet company, that, all of a sudden owns the materials. They care about good quality because they're going to be servicing them for a long time. But it also broadens the roles of architects, where our business model hasn't changed for a few centuries. It actually places us in a very entrepreneurial and exciting space where we can recoup value over the lifetime of a building. So there is fantastic opportunities to think about the whole life cycle carbon impacts. But I do think the building sector is incredibly conservative and entrenched. And I think a lot about the food sector because food and fashion in particular move much faster than the building sector. I collaborated for a long time with a chef, a good friend from Ghana, Sellah Bogonko, but really looking at how we might actually parallel track a lot of the shifts we want to see in the built environment alongside activists in the food space. Because they have multiple carbon benefits, indigenous plants that are flood tolerant, climate smart. All of those byproducts can also make their way into the building. So it's trying to see the multi-sectoral benefits, of these materials and not in isolation or not in just one lifetime. So that's maybe one approach, but yeah.
The only thing I'll add very quickly is I think we spend too much time worrying about which person is holding superior political leadership roles, particularly in Africa. We just over-obsess. I don't know of many places in the world where this work of innovation and transformation is led by political leaders. They can get in the way. We should work around that and figure out how to get better ones. But it's about social innovators. It's about real thinking. It's about real kind of grounded innovation is what I'll say.
Here. Serah, please.
I thought James's last point was spot on. The fonio grain that has taken off on the continent was started by a chef. Because fonio, the grain, is actually drought resistant. It's easy to grow in West African hard ground. And that movement started because a chef decided, we should incorporate this grain into foods, we should export it, we should get communities to start growing this grain. And now fonio is this sexy, it was called the new quinoa. But that innovation was not government-led, right? It was an individual who thought, I see an opportunity here, gathered other people, included the community, and has started a movement that is thriving. So I think leadership comes from very many places, and I just wanted to use that as an example.
I just wanted to add something that might be controversial because I think in doing the report, one of the big things, I don't know if I should say this out loud, but we got really hammered by the concrete lobby,
Well,
the cement industry.
To be expected, but.
But in that instance, I think one of the biggest things we realized was that the cement industry might be one of the biggest collaborators in the transition. To scale bio-based materials, we need time. We need something to buy us time to get the quality and the scale that we need. And the cement industry can actually play a sort of transitory role using biomass for all sorts of things to replace cement, to also advance carbon storage and sequestration technologies. We're seeing the same thing in other industries that we consider the enemy, like plastics, for example. And so who is going to pay, for the kind of infrastructure and development that we need? And it's actually those that have gained the most. And so I think private industry, particularly the conventional players, are actually going to be playing a huge role. And there's compromise, obviously, but we need them in this transition.
That's an excellent segue to the point of transition. In fact, I had a slide up showing how some bio-based products are biodegradable, and in some instances, some are not, to a lesser extent. And I think it was our conversation 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the role of bagasse being introduced into concrete and how it makes it lighter, fire retardant, as well as stronger. And it's all about being able to partner across the aisle with industries, and not seeing them as enemies, but seeing them as partners in a transition, which I think is super useful. We're coming close to time, and we have a performance that I did promise for everybody. But what I would like to use the next couple of minutes is any closing remarks from your perspectives in terms of messages that you would like recorded in perpetuity for today's conversation and for the future. I'd like to start with you, Doctor.
Recorded for perpetuity.
We have amazing students here who will be playing these recordings. They'll be learning from us. Yes, you can. If you don't, you're more than welcome to edit whatever.
Okay, well, this will need serious editing because I don't know why I'm in a very contrarian mood today. So. And I got really challenged by what you said, Mwangi. I do think that as a continent, we're at a fork in the road where we are at a fundamental question of how are we going to be able to build a sustainable prosperity for the continent? We need to figure that out. And is it going to be growth by any means necessary, or are there alternatives? I think that is the fundamental question that as a continent we're grappling with. And the contrarian piece is, I'm not sure that let's go and then we'll fix it after, which is not what you said, but it's what I heard. I'm not sure. How are you going to argue with that? It's not what you said, it's what I heard. As a continent, we have had too many of those moments of, oh crap, structural adjustment. Oh shit, now we have to go back and fix public education and public health because we probably shouldn't have killed it. You're talking about agriculture, food systems. One of the biggest challenges the continent is facing when it comes to agriculture is agricultural researchers. During structural adjustment period, we killed off agricultural colleges. And so we didn't train extension workers, we didn't train agricultural researchers. And so we are really hampered in this generation. We can't let the old ones retire because we are missing a generation there. So I think being thoughtful about and learning from the past to be thoughtful about where we're going is really important. And I don't think it should be growth by any means necessary. But actually, even more fundamental is the question, and you alluded to it, Makeka, the question of power and politics. I don't think we can have these conversations bypassing the question of politics, because also fundamental is what are the conditions under which Africans contest what that future needs to look like? And what role does capital have to play in shaping what options we see as viable options? I don't see it as a foregone conclusion that capital is getting capital, especially foreign capital, to invest in Africa is the ultimate good and goal that we're working towards. But where do we want capital to sit as we as Africans are discussing and debating what kind of future we want? I think those are some of the fundamentals that I'm grappling with.
Very powerful remarks. Thank you. Serah, would you like to go ahead? And then Dave.
Sure, I think I'll come in on narratives. It's something that at the top of the session we started talking about how we talk about the story of Africa and how we talk about our future. And, you know, a quick Google of Africa will give you all the narratives of poverty, pestilence, and peril. And it's really important that we tell a whole story of the opportunities and the fact that we have African solutions not to African problems, but we have African solutions to global problems. If we need to drive ourselves to a place of net zero, if the world needs to galvanize and get out of this climate mess that we have put ourselves in, the world needs Africa, and Africa has assets that benefits the rest of us. So I think this is a call for challenging the narrative we hear about Africa, and this is a call for Friends of Africa to get on board, because if we don't change that narrative, and narrative is not just about a story, it's about whether or not you attract capital. It's about your perception. It's about your ability to drive forward with hope and aspiration. So it's a call to action, really, for Friends of Africa to arise and tell a better story so we can attract the right amount of investment. We can develop the right innovation. So globally, we have a shot at getting out of this climate disaster.
Thank you. Thank you, Serah. Dave?
Well, the first thing that comes to me in listening to all of you in Africa, and coming from Brazil, where 55% of our population, our black incomes from Africa, and listening to you, like we need to listen to look at the past to build the future. There is a lot of healing and reparation to do in Latin America, in Africa, in all the South, and there is a lot of affection to be built and trust. Because we lost trust in the government, we lost trust in the biggest corporations, because in the end they will get the bioeconomy, they will have the green meat, the meat done in lab, everything is going to be provided. But I think the bottom-up solution, the grassroots solutions, they stay in the community and they make the communities free. And I could give many examples, I don't think it's the time, but I've seen, like, when you have a moment to listen to the grassroots, to those communities, what they know how to work and how to feed themselves, is where they know how to also access the public policies. We didn't talk so much about the public policies, but one chicken farm that we started in this river community, took a year for those women start a chicken farm, and there was no protein in this river community, that the river is poisoned and there is no more hunting. And it's indigenous communities and river communities. But after they did the chicken farm, they started an agroforest to feed the chicken. And now that they have the chicken, they are changing the menu with the things that they are growing in the agroforest. So I think we need to bring livelihoods in order for the bioeconomy to work. And these are these villages, they are working already 7 years with the University of the Amazon towards making their guaraná production organic and be able to get to the US, but they don't have food to eat. So I think livelihoods and bioeconomy and market needs to be more interconnected and interdependent.
Thank you so much, Dave. May?
Thank you for that. I think I'm going to take a segment out of a conversation I just had with my good friend who's a chef, and we realized some parallel things in our thinking. One is that, you know, if you were going to cook a cow or a part of a cow, chefs understand and they name every single part of the cow, the ribeye, the hump, the butt, the leg, whatever, and they understand the history of what that part of the cow had to do, and they know how to actually cook to bring out the value in that part. And I think for us that are becoming reacquainted with the plant world, with the fungi world, there's a huge need for us to also have that same care to understand all the different parts of our plants and fungi. Because if we don't truly understand what the components are, what they do, we don't value them, and we get what we have, tons of waste over its life cycle. So this question of value is huge. It applies not just to the materials we use, but who. So this idea of radical collaboration where indigenous leaders are working with scientists, you know, to look at all sorts of problems, interconnected problems are key. But we need a deep therapy session around what we value. I find myself doing that over and over again because I think what I expect and like from my built environment has been shaped by, you know, our contemporary values, and that needs, again, deep therapy.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. James?
I will keep it very brief and say I think there's a lot of really important debates and points that have been set up. I look forward to much wrestling of straw persons after the session, but really thank you, Mokena, for convening this conversation and giving us the opportunity to both learn from each other and hopefully contribute to each other's insights on this topic. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, but just to say that, I mean, that's the whole point of tonight, is to have conversations with contrarian views in order to sharpen our thinking and to deepen the thinking that or current understandings. And I'm very grateful for your contributions in that regard. We started a bit late, colleagues, today, but I am aware that there might be some questions in the audience. If there are any hands, I'm comfortable to take maybe 3 questions. After that, I'd love to hand over the stage to our amazing musician to perform, and then we can close the night. Do we have any questions, comments, or reflections? Thank you so much. I see one hand there. Oh, that's fantastic. If you don't mind, just your name and then the question, please.
My name is this Adam? Okay. I am Peter Fenn. I've been very much involved with people at the UNEP on the Regional Seas program, and there was an award from them and so on. The question is, can Africa restructure around the ocean instead of the colonies and no longer be confined to respective colonies? For example, we have the bizarre situation of Beijing hosting 54 African countries in a big conference. So you have 54 colonies which are confined to their colonial borders, and then one huge thing. So can there be oceanic organization of not only Africa, but actually the whole planet with the UN Environment Program's Regional Seas program, as opposed to the current condition of hundreds of members of the UN being ex-colonies?
Okay, that's question number 1. I'd like to take them in batches of 3. Where was the other question?
Sorry, I was moving around, so I didn't really hear his question, but I hope it's not similar to mine. My question is for your work in Africa or South America, what is the challenges that you face from a daily base to a big picture base when dealing with Western imperialism?
Thank you. Do we have a third question? So if I'll try and summarize, and hopefully I'll do justice to the first question. I think the first one was the question of the blue economy and the extent to which African countries are prioritizing that. And the second one is the question of how does Africa reconcile her relationship given the asymmetric power relationships with the global north? Who would like to take the first one?
I can take the second one.
Second one is yours. Who's first? Okay, I'll come in there because as an urbanist who's done some work on the distribution of cities, particularly in the African continent, you're absolutely right. A lot of them were designed for the exportation of goods. So if you look at the colonial urbanization model, where the capitals are oriented, where the ports are oriented, they tend to not serve the purposes of the countries in which they are in. However, what we're finding in most African countries is a drive towards secondary and tertiary cities and particularly the transition between the rural and urban dynamic is meaning that cities that probably were not as important maybe 10, 20 years ago are now increasingly becoming important. I would say that many countries are beginning to exploit and think about their blue economy. Namibia is a perfect example of that. But I'd also suggest that the blue economy is not just about ocean coastline, it's also about rivers and other sorts of resources. So if you look at countries like Rwanda and even to an extent Zambia, etc., the importance of rivers as a form of economic development, whether it's for kelp distribution of goods, or even the way that you think about different urbanization patterns is beginning to take place. So I would say in the main, the recognition that the colonial urbanization model has not served us as Africans, I think is there. I do think that much more emphasis needs to be placed on the bioeconomy. There is a tendency to think of bioeconomy as purely terrestrial and not as ocean. I did have a slide there where I did speak about aquatic and marine resources. We can think about kelp, we can think about mangroves, we can think about a whole range of opportunities, especially given the fact that Africa has quite an extensive coastline. So all I would say is yes, yes, yes. I think our governments need to be, those that have the blessings of coastal and water resources need to be far much more active in terms of how they think of that as a key part of their bioeconomy. I'll yield the second one to you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, one of the things that we talked about was financing. And we're bumping into the fact that there's some structures that exist that predated Africa's autonomy and voice. Our taxation structure was built in 1920. Many countries were not independent. Many African countries were not independent. The multilateral development banks were built in 80 years ago. So what we're bumping into is the fact that the rules that were created that uphold the governance of geopolitics or the financial structure inherently have a bias, because African governments and countries were not on the table when those rules were being created. And the designers of the rule typically design a system to benefit themselves. So what we're trying to do as advocates and many across the continent is challenge those rules to be a lot more inclusive, is challenge the fact that a lot of things are still based outside of the continent, whether in London or Brussels or DC, and they're supposed to benefit the continent. So right now there's a MPOX challenge, and the stockpiles are not in Africa, they're in Europe. And it takes a long time to get, and the products that are used to develop the vaccines are taken from the continent, but stockpiled elsewhere. So when the outbreak breaks out, it takes a long while before it comes back in. And so that structure is broken. So we need to rethink sort of the pathways that are used to govern how the world and Africa, how the world interacts with Africa and Africa interacts with the world.
Dr. Wanjiru, and you will close off the discussion. So the floor is yours.
The amount of pressure. I just to really emphasize and echo what Serah just said, that for me the question is, how do we envision a future? And that rope, I really love the analogy of a rope, reaching out to a rope instead of building a stepladder. But how do we do that, envision and work towards a future while being careful to not be ensnared by an ethic of inevitability of the systems that currently exist, right? Like, it is inevitable that X, Y, Z will happen. And so if we cannot untether our imagination and our vision from the global systems that exist and how Africa is located into them, we will do bioeconomy in a neo-colonial way. And so how do we imagine Africa doing bioeconomy in a way that is not inevitably tied to the imperial way in which we're currently embedded in global economy? One of my favorite lines that I heard recently is, and it's a wonderful South African content creator who looks at fashion and the pre-colonial history of African fashion. And she did this piece on African and Asian exchanges of fashion and inspirations of clothing. pre-colonial, in Africa's pre-colonial days. And she said something. She said, we need to remember there was a world before imperialism, and there will be a world after imperialism. What will that look like, and how can we untether ourselves from a world after imperialism? Can we start preparing ourselves and get comfortable with what that world after imperialism looks like? Because imperialism is too much at the front of our noses. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Please.
Just a quick one, because I love that example. I think one of the most interesting things is seeing the common ground between what's happening in communities here in the global north and the global south. In our initial work, we see outliers to the agricultural industry, bio-based companies, collaborating with upstate New York bioadhesive companies, because they actually have similar trajectories in terms of being the post-agricultural, post-manufacturing, or they feel those impacts. And the second is, in as much as the transatlantic slave trade has had a huge burden, on people from the diaspora and Africans, more recently we've started to look at innovations from, for example, George Washington Carver, who was a former enslaved person but became one of America's greatest scientists with over 1,000 patents in agriculture. He invented crop rotation. But it's from learning from collaborations with his legacy at Tuskegee University and looking at plant-based applications for color, for clay paints. And there's a diasporic collaboration that can emerge from a very traumatic history. So it's both, the communities that have been impacted by that history of capitalism and colonialism, as well as these transatlantic partnerships that I think are the kind of stories that allow us to imagine very differently. So thank you for that.
A round of applause for my amazing panel. Thank you.
Colleagues, the night is young, but also we've been here for some time. We started off the night with an amazing sectional piece of music by Honor, and I'm honored to have him here in person, and then we will close off the evening. I just wanted to say that what has been particularly gratifying for today's conversation was that I heard a number of keywords that fit into the theme of tonight. We spoke about the question of the world. We spoke about the question of the future. We spoke about the question of what does it mean to live. In many respects, Flow is about capturing this reimagination of different types of worlds, worlds of the past, worlds of the present, and worlds of the future. And I think it is absolutely appropriate that we can partner and think about how we can redesign and imagine what will it mean to live in the future in a way that is productive, given the resources of a single planet and the communities that are yet to come. That being said, let me give you a bit of a description of Honor. He's a singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist and producer, born and hailing from Dumfriesshire in South Scotland. Shields began playing music at age 6, teaching himself on an old piano that lay neglected in his parents' shed. His distinctive compositions and vocals caught the attention of indie label I Feel Love in LA, and shortly after releasing his first independent singles, he signed to Warner Records in the US as artist-producer Honor, hailed as a unique, raw talent by the label.